In this lecture, you are going to learn about Henry Hudson, the Dutch West Indian Company, Peter Minuit, the Patron system, slavery, and New Amsterdam. In 1581, the Netherlands had officially broken away from the Habsburgs and won a reputation as the freest of the new European nations. Ravaged by the turmoil of the Reformation, the Dutch embraced greater religious tolerance and freedom of the press than other European nations of the time. Dutch women maintained separate legal identities from their husbands and could therefore hold property and inherit full estates. Although the Dutch offer liberties, they offer very little democracy. Power remained in the hands of only a few. And Dutch liberties certainly had their limits. The Dutch advanced the slave trade and brought African slaves with them to the Americas. Slavery was an essential part of Dutch capitalist triumphs. The Netherlands built its colonial empire through the work of experienced merchants and navigators. The Dutch were the most advanced capitalists in the modern world and had extensive financial resources by creating innovative financial organizations such as the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the East Indian Company. And they will use those financial organizations and charter companies to expand their colonial empire in the Americas. The first explorer that will help the Dutch claim land in North America will be Henry Hudson. In 1609, Henry Hudson, employed by the Dutch East Indian Company, sailed into New York. In the spring of 1607, sailing for the Muscovy Company, Hudson, his son John, and 10 companions set forth for the discovery of a passage by the North Pole to Japan and China, believing that he will find an ice-free sea around the North Pole. Hudson struck out northward. Hudson stopped briefly in Iceland, then proceeded to the ferocious overhaul. Passing through it and entering Hudson Bay in early August, he then followed the east coast southward rather than striking boldly westward. Finding himself in James Bay at the southmost extremity of the Hudson Bay and with no outlet to the Pacific to be found, Hudson cruised aimlessly and winter overtook him. Soon chaos and desperation ensued among the crew, and mutineers seized Hudson, his son, and 7 others, casting them adrift in Hudson Bay in a small open boat on June 22nd, 1611. Although the ship sailed home to England with a couple of survivors, neither of the ringleaders returned with her, having been killed together with several others in a fight with some natives. No more was ever heard of Hudson and his small party, although In 1631 to 1632, another explorer found the ruins of a shelter possibly erected by the castaways. However, Hudson's contribution to geographical knowledge was great. His discoveries formed the basis for the Dutch colonization of the Hudson River. In 1614, the New Netherland Company won a charter permitting it to send out 4 voyages and trade with native peoples, especially those living near the entrances of 3 rivers, the South River, known today as the Delaware River, the North River or River Mayadas, known today as the Hudson River, and the French River, known today as the Connecticut River. Dutch traders soon established an outpost at Fort Orange, near present-day Albany. After unsuccessful efforts at colonization, the Dutch Parliament chartered the West Indian Company, a national joint stock company that will organize and oversee all Dutch ventures in the Western Hemisphere. Sponsored by the West Indian Company, 30 families arrived in North America in 1624, establishing a settlement on present-day Manhattan. The Dutch settlers did not take much of an interest in agriculture and focused on the more lucrative fur trade. Like the French, many Dutch will create alliances with the local natives to take advantage of the fur trade. So initially, it was in their interest to avoid conflict and use native knowledge to their advantage. In 1626, Director General Peter Minuit arrived in Manhattan under the direction of the West Indian Company. Minuit was to be in charge of administering the struggling colony. One of the first things Minuit did was to buy Manhattan from the Munising natives for 60 guilders, probably an equivalent to about $500 in today's dollars, but still an obvious bargain. The Dutch fashioned guidelines that conformed to the idea of Hugo Grotius, a legal philosopher who believed that native peoples possessed the same natural rights as Europeans. So colony leaders insisted that lands be purchased. But despite the seemingly honorable intentions, it is likely the Dutch paid the wrong Indians for the land, either intentionally or unintentionally, or that the Munising and the Dutch understood the transaction in very different terms. When we look at the purchase of Manhattan, we also have to take into account that the indigenous groups did not have the same concept of land ownership as the Europeans. So this transaction of items did not necessarily mean the Dutch now owned the land from the native point of view. Transactions like these illustrate both the Dutch attempt to find a more peaceful process of colonization and the inconsistency between European and Native American understandings of property. If anything, the purchase of Manhattan just highlights how since their arrival, Europeans, one way or another, were able to impose their Eurocentric worldview on the natives, often leading to disastrous consequences to the native way of life. Nevertheless, the island of Manhattan will grow to become the Dutch settlement of New Netherlands, and it will provide a launching pad to support its Caribbean colonies and attack Spanish trade. Trade with native peoples became New Netherlands' central economic activity. Dutch traders carried wampum along native trade routes and exchanged it for beaver belts. Wampum consisted of shell beads fashioned by Algonquin natives on the southern New England coast and was valued as a ceremonial and diplomatic commodity among the Iroquois. Wampum became a currency that will buy anything from a loaf of bread to a plot of land. In the interior of the continent, the Dutch retained valuable alliances with the Iroquois to maintain Beaverwick, modern-day Albany, as a hub for the fur trade. In the place where the Dutch built permanent settlements, the ideals of peaceful colonization succumbed to the settlers' increasing demand for land. Armed conflicts erupted as colonial settlements encroached on native villages and hunting lands. Profit and peace, it seemed, could not coexist. Through the Charter of Freedom and Exemptions of 1629, the Dutch West Indian Company first started to grant titles and land to some of its invested members. All members of the company who within 4 years established a colony of 50 persons over the age of 15 might select a tract of land outside of Manhattan Island. Over this territory, the patron was given a monopoly of grinding, hunting, fishing, and mining. Authority over the town which might spring in this area was also granted, as it was the first right of purchasing the produce of the tenants. The patron system granted large estates to wealthy landlords who subsequently paid passage for the tenants to work their land. The Dutch, who so proudly touted their liberties, also had to grapple with the reality of African slavery. The economic goals of the colony slowly crowded out any cultural and religious objections, and the much boasted liberties of the Dutch came to exist alongside a system of slavery. The colony brought 11 company-owned slaves in 1626, the same year that Minuit purchased Manhattan. Slaves were tasked with building New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City, including a defensive wall along the northern edge of the colony, the site of modern-day Wall Street. They created its roads and maintained its all-important port. But unlike Brazil and the Caribbean, where African slaves were primarily male, fears of racial mixing led the Dutch to import enslaved women, enabling the formation of African Dutch families. The colony's first African marriage occurred in 1641, and by 1650 there were at least 500 African slaves in the colony. By 1660, New Amsterdam had the largest urban slave population on the continent. As it was typical of the practice of African slavery in much of the early 17th century, Dutch slavery in New Amsterdam was less comprehensively exploitative than later systems of American slavery. Some enslaved Africans, for instance, successfully sued for back wages. Another example is when several company-owned slaves fought for the colony against the Manatee Indians. They petitioned for their freedom and won a kind of half-freedom situation that allowed them to work their own land in return for paying a large tax to their masters. The children of these half-free slaves, however, remained held in bondage by the West Indian Company. With the help of African slaves who helped build the infrastructure and the expanding fur trade, the colony was proving quite profitable. New Amsterdam had developed into a port town of around 1,500 citizens, and the incredibly diverse population of the colony had grown from 2,000 in 1655 to almost 9,000 in 1664. But despite its success, it will not be able to defend itself from its European adversaries. New Amsterdam will soon be taken away from the Dutch and become part of the English overseas empire. As a newly independent state, the Dutch began their own exploration and colonization of the Americas. Like the French, it was in the interest of the Dutch fur traders to cooperate with indigenous groups. However, conflict did occur as more and more Dutch began to encroach on native territory. The Dutch also brought African slaves to North America. Settlement happened slowly, but soon the Dutch established a colony that will bring profits to its investors. That is all for now. Please stay tuned for the next video lecture.